Hi, BookTube. Welcome to a Middlemarch meditation, a delayed Middlemarch meditation. I hope you weren't worried about me at the weekend because there was really no need. I was just lazy. I should have informed you that I didn't have the script 100% ready for Sunday, so I did not film. In fact, we weren't at home on Sunday, so there was just been a lot of cricket matches, and we're trying to fit them all in. The weather is nice, and we just feel like we should seize that moment. And what it does mean is that there's only going to be one Middlemarch meditation in July, but don't worry, I'm going to make it up. There's going to be 3 in August, so one way or another we're going to keep to the pace that you are all used to. And you'll remember we're also playing catch-up because I deleted the notes that I had. So during the last episode, we got to page 281, and suddenly I realized I have no notes. So we're going to kind of cover page 281 again, and this time pick up all the interesting stuff that I do need to tell you about. So today's reading is going to start from the bottom of page 280, the last paragraph. To this mental estate, mapped out a quarter of a century before to sensibilities thus fenced in, Mr. Casaubon had thought of annexing happiness with a lovely young bride, but even before marriage, as we have seen, he found himself under a new depression in the consciousness that the new bliss was not blissful to him. Inclination yearned back to its old, easier custom, and the deeper he went in domesticity, the more did the sense of acquitting himself and acting with propriety predominate over any other satisfaction. Marriage, like religion and erudition, nay, like authorship itself, was fated to become an outward requirement, and Edward Casaubon was bent on fulfilling unimpeachably all requirements, even drawing Dorothea into use in his study according to his own intention before marriage, was an effort which he was always tempted to defer, but for her pleading insistence it might never have begun. But she had succeeded in making it a matter of course that she should take her place at an early hour in the library and have work either of reading aloud or copying assigned her. The work had been easier to define because Mr. Casaubon had adopted an immediate intention. There was to be a new parergon, a small monograph on some lately traced indications concerning the Egyptian mysteries, whereby certain assertions of Warburton's could be corrected. References were extensive, even here, but not altogether shoreless, and sentences were actually to be written in the shape wherein they would be scanned by Brasenose and a less formidable posterity. These minor, monumental productions were always exciting to Mr. Casaubon. Digestion was made difficult by the interference of citations or by the rivalry of dialectical phrases ringing against each other in his brain. And from the first, there was to be a Latin dedication about which everything was uncertain except that it was not to be addressed to Carp. It was a poisonous regret to Mr. Casaubon that he had once addressed a dedication to Carp, in which he had numbered that member of the animal kingdom among the virus nullo evo perituros, a mistake which would infallibly lay the dedicator open to ridicule in the next age and might even be chuckled over by Pike and Tench in the present. Thus, Mr. Casaubon was in one of his busiest epochs, and as I begin to say a little while ago, Dorothea joined him early in the library where he had breakfasted alone. Celia, at this time, was on a second visit to Lowick, probably the last before her marriage, and was in the drawing-room expecting Sir James. Dorothea had learned to read the signs of her husband's mood, and she saw that the morning had become more foggy there during the last hour. She was going silently to her desk when he said, in that distant tone which implied that he was discharging a disagreeable duty, "Dorothea, here is a letter for you, which was enclosed in one addressed to me." It was a letter of 2 pages, and she immediately looked at the signature. "Mr. Ladislaw, What can he have to say to me?" she exclaimed, in a tone of pleased surprise. "But," she added, looking at Mr. Casaubon, "I can imagine what he has written to you about." "You can, if you please, read the letter," said Mr. Casaubon, severely pointing to it with his pen and not looking at her. "But I may as well say beforehand that I must decline the proposal it contains to pay a visit here. I trust I may be excused for desiring an interval of complete freedom from such distractions as have been hitherto inevitable, and especially from guests whose desultory vivacity makes their presence a fatigue." There had been no clashing of temper between Dorothea and her husband since that little explosion in Rome, which had left such strong traces in her mind that it had been easier ever since to quell emotion than to incur the consequence of venting it. But this ill-tempered anticipation that she could desire visits which might be disagreeable to her husband, this gratuitous defence of himself against selfish complaint on her part, was too sharp a sting to be meditated on until after it had been resented. Dorothea had thought that she could have been patient with John Milton, but she had never imagined him behaving in this way, and for a moment Mr. Casaubon seemed to be stupidly undiscerning and odiously unjust. Pity, that newborn babe which was by and by to rule many a storm within her, did not stride the blast on this occasion. With her first words, uttered in a tone that shook him, she startled Mr. Casaubon into looking at her and meeting the flash of her eyes. "Why do you attribute to me a wish for anything that would annoy you? You speak to me as if I were something you had to contend against. Wait at least till I appear to consult my own pleasure apart from yours." "Dorothea, you are hasty," answered Mr. Casaubon nervously. Decidedly, this woman was too young to be on the formidable level of wifehood, unless she had been pale and featureless and taken everything for granted. "I think it was you who were first hasty in your false suppositions about my feeling," said Dorothea in the same tone. The fire was not dissipated yet, and she thought it was ignoble in her husband not to apologize to her. "We will, if you please, say no more on this subject, Dorothea. I have neither leisure nor energy for this kind of debate." Here Mr. Casaubon dipped his pen and made as if he would return to his writing, though his hand trembled so much that the words seemed to be written in an unknown character. There are answers which, in turning away wrath, only send it to the other end of the room, and to have a discussion coolly waived when you feel that justice is all on your own side is even more exasperating in marriage than in philosophy. Dorothea left Ladislaw's 2 letters unread on her husband's writing table and went to her own place, the scorn and indignation within her rejecting the reading of these letters, just as we hurl away any trash towards which we seem to have been suspected of mean cupidity. She did not in the least divine the subtle sources of her husband's bad temper about these letters. She only knew they had caused him to offend her. She began to work at once, and her hand did not tremble. On the contrary, in writing out the quotations which had been given to her the day before, she felt that she was forming her letters beautifully, and it seemed to her that she saw the construction of the Latin she was copying, and which she was beginning to understand more clearly than usual. In her indignation there was a sense of superiority, but it went out for the present in firmness of stroke, and did not compress itself into an inward articulate voice pronouncing the once affable archangel a poor creature. There had been this apparent quiet for half an hour, and Dorothea had not looked away from her own table when she heard the loud bang of a book on the floor, and turning quickly saw Mr. Casaubon on the library steps, clinging forward as if he were in some bodily distress. She started up and bounded towards him in an instant. He was evidently in great straits for breath. Jumping on a stool, she got close to his elbow and said, with her whole soul melted into tender alarm, "Can you lean on me, dear?" He was still for 2 or 3 minutes, which seemed endless to her, unable to speak or move, gasping for breath, when at last he descended the 3 steps and fell backwards in the large chair which Dorothea had drawn close to the foot of the ladder. He no longer gasped, but seemed helpless and about to faint. Dorothea rang the bell violently, and presently Mr. Casaubon was helped to the couch. He did not faint, and was gradually reviving, when Sir James Chetham came in, having been met in the hall with the news that Mr. Casaubon had had a fit in the library. Good God, this is just what might have been expected, was his immediate thought. If his prophetic soul had been urged to particularize, it seemed to him that fits would have been the definite expression alighted upon. He asked his informant, the butler, whether the doctor had been sent for. The butler never knew his master want the doctor before, but would it not be right to send for a physician? When Sir James entered the library, however, Mr. Casaubon could make some signs of his usual politeness, and Dorothea, who, in the reaction from her first terror, had been kneeling and sobbing by his side, now rose and herself proposed that someone should ride off for a medical man. "I recommend you to send for Lidgett," said Sir James. "My mother has called him in, and she has found him uncommonly clever. She has had a poor opinion of the physicians since my father's death." Dorothea appealed to her husband, and he made a silent sign of approval. So Mr. Lidgett was sent for, and he came wonderfully soon, for the messenger, who was Sir James Chetham's man and knew Mr. Lidgett, met him leading his horse along the Lowick road and giving his arm to Miss Vincey. Celia, in the drawing-room, had known nothing of the trouble till Sir James told her of it. After Dorothea's account, he no longer considered the illness a fit, but still something of that nature. "Poor dear Dodo, how dreadful," said Celia, feeling as much grieved as her own perfect happiness would allow. Her little hands were clasped and enclosed by Sir James as a bud is enfolded by a liberal calyx. "It is very shocking that Mr. Casaubon should be ill, but I never did like him, and I think he is not half fond enough of Dorothea, and he ought to be, for I am sure no one else would have had him. Do you think they would?" "I always thought it a horrible sacrifice of your sister," said Sir James. "Yes, but poor Dodo never did do what other people do, and I think she never will." "She is a noble creature," said the loyal-hearted Sir James. He had just had a fresh impression of this kind, as he had seen Dorothea stretching her tender arm under her husband's neck and looking at him with unspeakable sorrow. He did not know how much penitence there was in the sorrow. "Yes," said Celia, thinking it was very well for Sir James to say so, but he would not have been comfortable with Dodo. "Shall I go to her? Could I help her, do you think?" "I think it would be well for you just to go and see her before Lidgett comes," said Sir James magnanimously, "only don't stay long." While Celia was gone, he walked up and down, remembering what he had originally felt about Dorothea's engagement, and feeling a revival of his disgust at Mr. Brooke's indifference. If Cadwallader, if everyone else had regarded the affair as he, Sir James, had done, the marriage might have been hindered. It was wicked to let a young girl blindly decide her fate in that way without any effort to save her. Sir James had long ceased to have any regrets on his own account. His heart was satisfied with his engagement to Celia, but he had a chivalrous nature. Was not the disinterested service of woman among the ideal glories of old chivalry? His disregarded love had not turned to bitterness. Its death had made sweet odours, floating memories that clung with a consecrating effect to Dorothea. He could remain her brotherly friend, interpreting her actions with generous trustfulness. After that reading, I'm not going to go on to the analysis. I'm going to be so rebellious today. You're having to wait for this, and now I'm just going off on a tangent, but I'm going to start with a rabbit hole. And this is because I found a website. I found that the University of Birmingham has got a fiction blog site, and you're going to find a link in my description box. And pardon me while I read from my notes now, because this is quite heavy stuff. It looks like the website is a great resource for readers and also writers who are interested in creating fiction set in England during the 19th century, and they want to get the tone and the language right. The article that caught my eye was written by Eleonora Gallitelli, and it concerns her study of the words that were used to describe the affection of characters, and she analyzes the difference between the affections of Dorothea and Mr. Casaubon, the affections of Rosamond Vincy versus Dr. Lidgett, and also the affections expressed between Mary Garth and Fred Vincy. And I'm quoting from the beginning of her article, where Gallitelli says this. She says, Eliot conceives of the major benefit of the novel form in general as, quote, the extension of our sympathies, since art, she famously writes in her essay, The Natural History of German Life, is, quote, a mode of amplifying experience and extending our contact with our fellow man beyond the bounds of our personal lot. So that's Eliot's own definition of the purpose of fiction. I'd not seen that before. She says, a mode of amplifying our experience and extending our contact with our fellow men beyond the bounds of our personal lot. So this is clearly what she's trying to do in Middlemarch. Now, there's been a lot of discussion on BookTube about the Guardian's list of the most important 100 books, and in particular the fact that Middlemarch grabbed the top spot on that list. And I wonder whether George Eliot herself would probably be less interested in the list and more interested in what motivated many authors who chose to include Middlemarch in their top 10 list. Because, if you look through the raw data of the writers involved, she might have wanted to know, what were they really thinking when they chose to put Middlemarch on their top 10 lists and contribute to its being in the number one spot? And we know that these rankings are probably saying more about the people choosing the books than the books themselves. And what I mean is, if I were, let's say, or you were a recognized published author with a reputation, and you were invited by the Guardian newspaper to submit a list of 10 books that you thought were most important, what would motivate your choices? What would motivate my choices? Okay, so the chances are good, if I am this recognized published writer, chances are good I have a university education. And in fact, I should add something that I've noticed, that it seems to me that a high number of published authors that we recognize were educated at either Oxford or Cambridge, okay? And I'd like to compile some data on that one day, just using my published book reviews, because it seems to me that so many of them have gone to the same universities, or if they're American, there's often a high chance they've gone to Yale, Harvard, Princeton, one of those Ivy League universities. And even though my reading is eclectic, I'm still finding that so many of them are coming from a small number of educational institutions. So you have to ask that whether, to one degree or another, the authors picking their books for the top 10 are picking books that they've been taught or that they've been taught to revere. So that's a point to make. But that's just one possibility, because I did find authors in the Guardian's raw data that chose unusual titles for their top 10 list. And I'm grateful for those. I do check a lot of those authors' lists of top 10, looking for titles that don't appear on the top 100, because I think, well, that book must have left an impression. It must still be important to read. But I'm digressing a little bit. I'm getting away from what I wanted to say about Middlemarch. When I submitted a list to the Guardian, because you could do that, yes, I put Middlemarch in my top 10 list, even though I haven't finished reading it yet. But I guess I want to talk about, really, what were the reasons why I rate Middlemarch as highly as I do? So I've got a few reasons. Number one, I chose Middlemarch because it does focus on this extension of our sympathies. That is, it creates some characters and we get to know them quite closely, doing very everyday things, coping with the kind of circumstances that ordinary people in their time might have had to deal with. And it doesn't try to do anything more profound than that. And that's because I think Eliot realized that getting into close sympathy with so many characters, actually getting in their heads, seeing where they came from, where they are now, and how they're going to cope day to day with these small decisions, that is a profound act of and by itself. The characters have not been created as servants to the story structure. The story has maybe a little bit less structure, Middlemarch does, because it's growing organically out of the characters' personalities, motivations, background, everything that makes them them. So that's one of the reasons. And the second, it's because the sympathy extends to the past, which made the characters what they are, right? So hence all the references to the past, to writers and theologians and scientists, and to the way of life that is normal to those characters in the book. And it includes their prejudices, their lack of knowledge, or their private dreams of the future based on what they understand is possible. It is the fullest possible picture of this tiny point in space-time. And to me, that does make a novel great. I'm not always so impressed with conceptual things. I'm not always so impressed with playing around with prose. I've read the modernist novels with their attempts at consciousness, and although I find that interesting, what impresses me more in a novel are those two things: this ability to create this incredibly detailed portrait of real people in a point of time and in a place, and you can tell those people belong to that place and belong to that time by what they say and what they do. And yet, in choosing to be so detailed about that time and place, universal themes reveal themselves, and universal lessons that could apply to any time and any place magically reveal themselves. I find this wonderful. And this isn't the only novel in which I've noticed this kind of thing happening. I could mention some others which I've read and reviewed on this channel. Just for example, here's a few. The Vendor of Sweets by R.K. Narayan, Queenie by Candace Carty-Williams, The Unpassing by Xia Lin, Hotel du Lac by Anita Bruckner, Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, Another Country by James Baldwin, Amy and Isabel by Elizabeth Strout, and Of Love and Other Demons by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. That's just some of books doing the same thing, getting in close to a small group of people in their time and in their space, and giving you their everyday decisions in that. And by doing that, you automatically draw principles from that, because watching people live their lives and cope always brings out moral, philosophical lessons that you can pull from that. Something interesting that I did notice when I look back on the books that I have read, I could not identify a book written by a white male author of some renown which had this same purpose that Eliot's book has, and that is of extending our sympathies to everyday people doing everyday things. The closest that I came was a collection of short stories written by Richard Yates, 11 Types of Loneliness. But there are drawbacks in Yates in the sense that most of the stories cultivated a sympathy for men, male characters, and the viewpoint characters, with only a few exceptions, tended to be men. And that's something I might need to look at more closely. Do white male authors, is their focus when writing a novel something other than that intense, detailed, sympathetic portrayal of characters in their environment making everyday decisions? And I want to also add that the list of novels that I read out, they aren't exactly like Middlemarch in the sense that whereas Eliot's narrator gives you kind of full godlike access to other minds and also an awful lot of other knowledge that you probably don't have, some of these books pick a viewpoint character and focus you in on them. And so yes, that to some degree limits your sympathy, but I think in every case the author has a reason for keeping it limited. And so really it's just the last four which have alternative viewpoints on, and you will probably I'll edit this video and put the list of those novels, so if you're interested in looking at the reviews again or reading them, you can do so. What might be true of Middlemarch, and this may be the reason that it deserves its importance, is that I think it could be said to be the first novel in English to have this singular purpose of extending sympathy and creating uncompromising realism. Nothing about the characters or the events which happen to them seem at all to be, exaggerated for effect or selected by the author to fit a plot construction. And perhaps the first English novel to pursue this purpose by allowing the reader very generous access to the minds of all the major characters and being even more even-handed in allowing sympathy to develop for both male and female characters. Okay, that's my rabbit hole. It went kind of long, but I really felt I wanted to make that point about Middlemarch. What is it to me that makes it such an important novel? How does it get this sort of foundational, groundbreaking status that it seems to hold? That's my thoughts on the subject. Let's go now to page 281, to the bits that I should have talked about in the last episode, starting with a character called William Warburton. Now, he was an English writer and the Bishop of Gloucester. He was born in 1689. So there we've got the 17th century again, and he died in 1779. Now, Casaubon seems to be writing this pamphlet of his to correct some of Warburton's assertions about Egyptian hieroglyphs. And so he's probably referring to Warburton's work of 1741 called The Divine Legation of Moses. And so we see here another symptom of Casaubon's lack of intellectual energy. Warburton's work is not contemporary. It's nearly 100 years old at the time the book is set. I don't know the details of Warburton's work, but a bit of online research tells me that Warburton was refuting a belief at his time that was widespread, that European scholars felt that hieroglyphs must be some means of encoding religious secrets. That's what they thought was all tied up in hieroglyphs. Warburton was the first one to argue differently and said that the glyphs were practical, right? They were not esoteric. They were probably just in an ordinary writing system. And 20 years after his death, in 1799, the Rosetta Stone was discovered, and it proved him to be correct. But even before 1799, there were other European scholars who were comparing the shapes of hieroglyphs with the shapes of phonetic characters in known non-Egyptian scripts like Aramaic, and there were medieval Islamic scholars who knew how to translate the Egyptian script into their own language. So if we recall Will Ladislaw's remarks about Casaubon decrying his uncle for not keeping up with current research, I can't help but worry about this pamphlet idea that he has, and that it's just going to prove Ladislaw's point all over again. If Casaubon plans to criticize Warburton by claiming that the Egyptian characters should not be interpreted as linguistic symbols, but as something more religious in character, he will make himself look like an absolute fool if that pamphlet is published, unless he also addresses the more recent findings and he can successfully argue against those. But it doesn't sound as though he has any notion that they exist. And of course, the more recent scholarship almost certainly hasn't been published in English. And we know that Mr. Casaubon has this aversion to things that are not English. We know he cannot read German, so it's unlikely he would have a knowledge of French. He might do, because there is something about French which is, you sometimes have to learn it for polite conversation, but I doubt it somehow. Somehow I doubt it. And the other thing I want to touch upon is the Latin phrase that's used on page 281, viros nullo evo perituros. In Latin, it means a man who will never perish. And Casaubon, he bestows this honor upon Carp, but it's clear that he now feels embarrassed for having made this compliment. And I could only think of three possible reasons for this embarrassment. One, Eliot's narrator says that Casaubon, in his dedication to Carp, claimed that he numbered that member of the animal kingdom as viros nullo evo perituros. If that was his exact phrasing, it would be a bit like saying, I've always considered carp as a fish to be an immortal man, or a man that will not perish. So he's applying the Latin phrase that's clearly talking about humans to animals, which may suggest that he doesn't really know how to translate the Latin, but he's just dropping the phrase into the sentence. He's got a vague notion that it means something about immortality, but he doesn't know the language well enough, and that is worrying if he doesn't understand Latin well enough as a trained clergyman. I do now begin to question his education. Where was it conducted? Where did he go? Yeah, lots of questions there. Point two, Eliot's narrator says that Casaubon will certainly be ridiculed about the dedication by readers in the future, and I'm guessing that's because at some point this person named Carp will die. And so Casaubon's claim that Carp will never perish, yeah, you can fill in the rest of that sentence without my help, I think. And point 3, I never know how much credibility to give to things said in online forums, but I did spot a comment from someone who claimed that Casaubon's dedication would seem ridiculous because this Carp was, in actuality, not a particularly famous or credited scholar. So if Mr. Casaubon's intention was to state that Carp's scholarship would never perish, that his work would be respected by posterity, the online commenter suggested that Carp was already looking like a small fish in a big pond during Casaubon's lifetime. And if you think about it, honoring someone as an immortal, whether you are actually meaning that they're going to live forever, but more likely what Casaubon was probably trying to say was that their work would continue to be highly regarded. You have to be someone of renown yourself to be able to judge. Otherwise, your judgment is a joke. Casaubon is not great or famous himself, so how can he make any kind of judgment on the work of Carp? And if Carp himself is only some minor scholar that's hardly noticed, then really, it might be better if Mr. Carp was named Mr. Minnow or Mr. Guppy, because that would be more in keeping with how small these are two small, unimportant people giving themselves great honors and great airs when nothing of the sort is true. Now, we get to the part of the text which would have been this episode proper, and I have to note how Dorothea has learned to read her husband as though she is a meteorologist of his mind. She notes that the morning had become more foggy there in the last hour, meaning that her husband is like a little climate within himself, and Dorothea is his weather station, and she knows his moods, so she enters the library silently. Nevertheless, he hands her this letter, and I think it's rather interesting that she recognizes the signature with a tone of pleased surprise, which might have already hit her husband badly, because there is some jealousy there. He might have noted the pleasure even if she didn't and disliked it, or he presumed that this communicated pleasure might be what's going to lead her to beg him to allow Ladislaw to visit. So in some ways, her indignation about, why is he assuming that I'll want to fight him about this visit business? Well, he's noted how pleased she is to receive this letter. He's noted that pleasure in her tone, and he probably thinks, oh, I'm going to have a fight on my hands now. So if they could have talked more about this, had they been able to conduct conversations properly, and that is partly Mr. Casaubon's fault. He isn't good at this. He isn't good at talking things out. He doesn't know how to do that. But I think they might have realized where the root was of this bad feeling from Mr. Casaubon. And I love this little quote. It's on the top of page 282 when Casaubon is giving Dorothea all these reasons why he doesn't want Ladislaw to visit. And he mentions that he's already getting kind of worn out by guests whose desultory vivacity was fatiguing him. I just thought that was so funny. I used to think, this is going back some years now, I used to think desultory meant dull or dreary or in a bad mood. That was just the sound of the word made me think that's got to be the meaning. But of course it comes from the Latin dusultor, which was the term for a circus rider who could jump from the back of one horse to another. So Mr. Casaubon is referring to those guests who've come to his house to make the expected post-wedding visits, and these would be people whose social standing was high enough to have received an invitation to the wedding in the first place and who lived nearby. And of those few people, the only characters I imagine being desultory, that is jumping from this thing to that thing with, and being vivacious or energetic or enthusiastic, which suggests talkative, the only character I think matches that description is Mr. Brooke. In fact, he is my number one choice. So James Chettam might also be talkative, but I think more likely to stay on a topic. Mr. Brooke, I think more likely to jump around from thing to thing. Mrs. Cadwallader is the other chatty character, but she's not fond of Mr. Casaubon, is she? She disapproves of this marriage. So somehow I imagine that she would visit once and just keep it short. But the important thing is, does Dorothea recognize this as a reference to her uncle? Because again, that might be another reason why she loses her temper. It's not just that Mr. Casaubon is presuming that she will argue with him about further visits. It's that he's just insulted her uncle, the guardian, the man who brought her and Celia up, took on responsibility for them after their parents died. She's going to feel affection. She's going to feel attachment. It's going to hurt to hear her husband speak, even though he doesn't name Mr. Brooke. She's going to know. She knows her uncle well enough. So that's another factor there. You can see the two factors that are feeding into the bad temper and the argument here. And I note how Dorothea uses some pretty strong phrases in her mind, or these are how the narrator is describing her feelings. Stupidly undiscerning is how she describes Mr. Casaubon, that she's feeling that he is being it. She resents that her husband hasn't come to understand her as well as she's come to understand him. There's no Dorothea weather station that Mr. Casaubon consults to think, oh, what's my wife's mood? How shall I approach her? He has no such thing. Where she has provoked, she has also apologized to him profusely. The last time they had an argument, she was the one that did all the apologizing. And now she is exasperated that all this effort on her part is never being recognized. And he still feels the need to defend himself against a wife who not only doesn't plan to attack, but even if she makes a mistake and he interprets it as an attack, she apologizes. She's just tired of this. And ironically, it's Casaubon's lack of discernment, his fear that she will attack, which provokes an attack. If he'd been fearless and just assumed that she would understand, the chances are this argument would never have happened. And now we need to drop down a little bit to where Eliot quotes Macbeth. It's Eliot's narrator talking about comparing Dorothea's sense of pity to a newborn babe, which, she says, has very often strode the blast, but on this occasion fails to feel pity for Mr. Casaubon and therefore calm down her own internal storm of anger. Now, the quote from Macbeth it's a little bit different. Pity acts differently. If you know the play, this is from Act 1, Scene 7. It's the opening. It's just after King Duncan has arrived at Macbeth's palace and he's having dinner there. And Macbeth and his wife, on the strength of the three witches' prophecy, they believe that they will be able to murder the king and get away with it, because the witches have said to them, Macbeth is destined to become king. They don't consider, well, what might be the best way to let that happen, or to even let that happen. Lady Macbeth is determined, no, we don't let it happen. We make it happen. And so Macbeth himself, he still has a conscience, perhaps more than his wife, or differently ordered than his wife, because we see his wife's disturbance of conscience later in her sleepwalking. But he struggles with his decision in this scene. He knows that Duncan trusts him, and that Duncan has been a good king, someone whose virtues are so great that they're going to rise up and speak to the world against Macbeth, right? Along with pity and heaven's cherubim. Everything that is good is going to look at what Macbeth plans to do if he carries out this deed, and everything, this horrid deed, is going to cause everyone who hears it to weep with pity. Let me read the extract from Shakespeare. This is Macbeth speaking about King Duncan. He's here in double trust. First, as I am his kinsman and his subject, strong both against the deed. Then, as his host who should against his murderer shut the door, not bear the knife myself. Besides, this Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office, that his virtues will plead like angels trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off, and pity like a naked newborn babe striding the blast, or heaven's cherubim horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air, shall blow the horrid deed in every eye, that tears shall drown the wind. And we've talked about Casaubon not apologizing. He's never apologized. And I say this while believing that Casaubon does not perceive that he's said anything he needs to apologize for. His mind was on himself and his own needs, and we know he's minutes away from some kind of heart problem, I don't know what, which means he's probably already feeling very unwell and he's not admitting it. And yet the problem between them exists because Casaubon never feels he needs to try to understand his wife. And so he's baffled. Whenever she does show emotion, he just doesn't know what to do with it. It doesn't occur to him to try to understand it. His words hurt now because they're piling up on top of the words that he said in Rome, for which he also made no apology, and he barely accepted Dorothea's apology. And at the top of page 283, Eliot's narrator gives a warning. If you try to push away somebody's anger, that doesn't get rid of the anger, it just moves it, wherever the angry person moves to, in this case, just a few feet away in the room. And it guarantees that they become more angry. Now we note that Mr. Casaubon's writing hand trembles after he closes down the discussion. It suggests that he knows he doesn't understand the problem, and therefore he'll be worried that anything else he says is just going to bring unhappy words from Dorothea, and he doesn't know why, and he just wants them to stop, rather than thinking that if he tries to understand them, that might be the better way to take away the tension. It's a very sad scene to read, because neither person in this marriage can really correctly read the other. They're an open book to us, of course, but closed books to each other. And they're standing in a library, of all places, right? They're literate, educated people, but what is the good of all that to them now? And I must admit, I am most interested now in how differently Dorothea reacts when the argument is over. Her hand doesn't tremble. And Eliot's narrator, for the first time, describes a sense of superiority. Now that is huge, because you remember, before marriage, she was utterly convinced that Casaubon was the superior person, the superior intellect. Now, during their honeymoon, that conviction was made unstable, and now it seems at this point, she's suddenly getting an inkling, I might be the better person in this couple. I might be the one with greater intelligence. It's a horrible sort of realization, because it's going to affect how she behaves towards him surely from now on. On a lighter note, let's talk about library steps, just to take the mood up a little bit. 19th century library furniture. This is probably a set of movable steps that allows Casaubon to reach books on higher shelves. And they come in so many forms, and I felt I had to show off some varieties. So you will see some photographs now, right? Some look as functional as a stepladder. They're nothing more than that. And I mean, that is the main purpose. But some also had integral storage drawers, and some could also be folded up and used as chairs. I like those. I think that's very clever. And some curved slightly, and they had a handhold of some kind, which might be, if Mr. Casaubon had one of those, it might be what he clung to. I think it shows him, leaning forward and holding on. He could have either been holding on to the bookshelves, or if there were some handles on these particular set of library steps, he might have been clinging to those. And later on the page, it says, when at last he descended the 3 steps, which could mean that his library steps were only 3 steps high, or that he'd only reached the 3rd step before medical problems started. We would need to know the size of his library to be sure of what furniture he needed. And credit to Dorothea, once she sees the problem, her whole soul melted into tender alarm. She dropped all her anger and her feelings of superiority. She just pushed those away. I felt that's credit to her, that she could do that and be selfless for his sake. We're also very lucky that Sir James Chetham is present and has the experience and also the presence of mind to know what to do next. Top of page 284, how vindicated Sir James must now feel. Back in chapter 8, he vented his feelings about the Casaubon engagement to the Rector Cadwallader, and he said about Casaubon, I'm quoting now, I don't believe he could ever have been much more than the shadow of a man, and also he has got no good red blood in his body. Well, we know something's wrong, and probably has been wrong for a while, and it's unfortunate now that He's feeling vindicated, but, what good does it do? And Celia, bless her, responds as she should, but feeling as much grieved as her perfect happiness would allow. I mean, she's thrilled with how her life is going, and I think she and Sir James do make a pretty decent match. There's a compatibility there that I think is going to work. We'll find out. And I love this beautiful little Victorian image as a bud is enfolded by a liberal calyx. It's a very pretty, very Victorian bit of horticultural imagery. I've put up a picture of a rose bush. It's got 5 buds, and this is for all the non-gardeners who are watching, who may be wondering, as I did, what on earth is a calyx? The calyx is the green covering that encloses a budding flower. So this photo is perfect because it shows the different stages of flowering. If we count in from the left, buds 3 and 4 are tightly closed and inside the calyx, no flower petal showing. Bud number 2 from the left, the calyx is split open so we can see the budding flower and the petals are still pretty tightly closed. Bud number 1, the flower petals are opening and the calyx you can see is spreading to the side. And bud number 5 is not a bud anymore, it is a full blooming rose. And you can see the calyx has folded away so that its fronds are underneath the rose and pointing down. So when I picture Celia's small little clasp hands covered by Sir James' hands, I think of an image a little bit like bud number 2. And at the top of page 285, there's just a hint, just the tiniest hint of jealousy from Celia, fairly well disguised. She says she thinks it was very well for Sir James to say so, to say how noble Dorothea is, but he would not have been comfortable with Dodo. So this is our first kind of X-ray view of this relationship. Celia and Sir James, as I say, I think they're better suited than some of our other couples. They certainly share the same opinion about whether it was wise for Dorothea to have married Casaubon. But, Celia, she doesn't strike me as a jealous type. And at the moment, I'm interpreting her thought as an example of how well she always seems to understand the social and cultural reality in which she is living. She knows how adept she is at functioning in that reality and how clumsy, by contrast, her older sister is because of all her enthusiasms and notions, as she calls them, which never fit societal expectations for Dorothea as a woman and an upper-class woman. But if you've read all of Middlemarch and you have some different thoughts about Celia's true feelings, by all means share a comment. Also, do you think Celia and Sir James will become a happily married couple? Are they going to be one of the few successful matches in the novel that live into old age together still with a great deal of affection for each other? Just be interested to know your thoughts. And the chapter ends with Sir James Chetham musing on the glories of old chivalry. And I found that paragraph so interesting. As it happens, I was reading a novel concurrently with preparing this script that is based in 13th century south of France, where the whole chivalry thing, the culture of the troubadours, etc., that was going on, and the novel gave a lot of detail. So it felt interesting to be back in that time and then hearing this 19th century character musing on those old glories. If you don't know what chivalry is or where it comes from, we're talking about the High Middle Ages, beginning, I think, in the south of France, but then spreading as a sort of courtly cult, if you will. I have to call it that because maybe someone who's got a qualification in medieval studies or an enthusiastic hobbyist who's into this period, if you want to correct me and say, that's a little strong, cult, please do. But I feel that there were these ideas fastened onto people's behavior, this business of chivalry, because it controlled a man's behavior towards married and unmarried women of noble lineage. So it only applied to a small number of women as well. I think that's important. So courtly love was associated with this. Chivalry was how you treated women, whether they were married or unmarried, but you could display courtly love towards a woman, whether she was your wife or no, whether there was any possibility of her being your wife or no. And this allowed you to serve a woman and express your love in a non-sexual way. And I'm not saying that there wasn't erotic desire behind, those actions fueling that courtly love. But this sort of cult idea of courtly love and courtly behavior, it allowed a man to express devotion to a woman without doing anything sexual through acts of service or sacrifice. It had an influence on how gentle women, and note the class element there, this is really important. It influenced how gentle women or ladies were to be treated in general. And some of that influence, of course, trickled down into the 19th century, part of the Romantic revival of the time, I should think, and it's affected how Sir James thinks of Dorothea Brooke. I can't imagine that Eliot is making this point purely as an, oh, by the way, this is what Sir James Chetham now thinks of Dorothea. He wants to continue this brotherly, chivalric devotion to her. Now, we know chivalry is problematic because it had class distinctions. You needed to be the correct class to be treated like a lady, but there were also behavior qualifications, right? You can, of course, there were. A woman who behaved incorrectly could be regarded as no longer noble, no longer worthy of the respect and service of chivalry. So James has excused Dorothea's choice of husband because she was young. If later on in the book she takes a decision that he also disagrees with, she may find she loses him as an ally and brotherly devotee. He might fall off the pedestal. She might fall off the pedestal that he seems to have put her on. It will be interesting to see what happens. And that is today's meditation done. I am at work on the script for the beginning of chapter 30 already, and I promise I'm going to try to have it ready for this weekend. I'm trying to decide whether or not to spread the close reading of the whole chapter over one episode or two. I think the epigraph is what's going to decide things, because the epigraph is only a few words long in chapter 30, but every time I look into them, this incredible rabbit hole always opens up. So 2 meditations may be necessary to give that chapter justice. Yeah, stay tuned for that. In the meantime, everybody, have good reading, and I'll see you again in a few days' time. Take care. Bye-bye.